Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Rachel Copeland, and I'm from Boswell Book Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we thank you so much for being here tonight. Today is day 5,115 of Boswell being in business, and that's thanks to people like you who support independent bookstores. We will be talking to not one, but two lovely authors of two lovely books. And so the first author I'll introduce is Willson Holladay. She's an associate professor of media theory and criticism at Missouri State University. And her research about identity, popular media, and media audiences has been published in journals such as Journal of Fandom Studies, Feminist Media Studies, and the Journal of Popular Culture. And then our second author of the hour is Erin Giannini, who is an independent scholar in television studies and has served as an editor for Pop Matters. She's the author of Supernatural, A History of Television's Unearthly Road Trip, and Joss Whedon versus the Corporation. Both of them will be talking about their books, Parks and Recreation and The Good Place, part of the TV Milestones series by Wayne State University Press. So thank you so much for being here, ladies, and take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rachel. We're excited that you all are here and are spending your Tuesday evening with us. The way that Erin and I talked about going about this that we thought would be fun and hopefully the most engaging for you all is to interview each other and have a little bit of a conversation about our books and research process generally. So we're going to spend some time asking each other questions, and then we wanted to leave as much time as possible to answer whatever questions you all have about our books or our research. If you want to drop a question in the chat, I think that whenever Erin and I wrap up, Rachel's going to hop back in and moderate that for us. And so our first question, we sort of collaborated on this to see, to sort of figure out how we wanted to talk about this and especially talk about them together. So I'm going to start by asking Erin, tell me and everyone else what it is that inspired you to write your Good Place book.
Well, I really loved the TV Milestones format. Some scholar friends of mine had used it, and it's such a nice, neat little form. You know, you get 25 to 30,000 words. You can focus on one single show. And so it was kind of always in the back of my mind that I wanted to maybe submit something for them. And when they announced that The Good Place would be ending after season 4, and I was, pretty into it, I'm like, this would be the perfect show to write about. There's so much going on here with the philosophy, and theological questions and post-network television and all these kind of things. So I actually started working on the proposal as the 4th season was airing and sent it off the day after the finale aired.
You got to beat everybody else to the punch.
I just thought that there would be a lot of people who wanted to write about it. Although there hasn't actually been a lot of work around The Good Place as of yet. So I'm glad I got out there quickly. And what inspired you to write about Parks and Recreation?
I love that we started with this question. Obviously, we collaborated on this and we knew what we were going to say. I always feel like I start with everything. What inspires me, it sort of inspires my research, always starts with how lucky I feel to be able to write about television and to think about television critically and investigate how it is more than just this is a really ordinary thing that structures our day-to-day lives. But it is so much more than that. It's so much, really plays into, I believe John Fisk says, is a cultural storyteller. And I firmly believe that to be true. So I always like to start with that because I think it's important in grounding how I come to all of my research. But I loved Parks and Rec. I say in the acknowledgements of my book, it was on when I was in graduate school. It aired its finale a couple of months before I defended my dissertation. And so for me, it was such a personal thing. And it was like getting to write, as I say, a really long love letter to something that was like really significant to me in the latter half of my 20s when I was in graduate school. I was really struck, I think, as I started to think about writing about the series, how reflective it was of the time in which it aired, especially, it's a show about politics. It's a show about local government. And it's contained entirely within the Barack Obama presidency, his 2 terms, 2008 to 2016, and it runs from 2009 to 2015. And so being about politics of that moment and thinking about how we could understand what's going on culturally in relationship to that television show. And I think the other thing too, as a huge fan of the show, as an avid participant in Galentine's Day, many years over, I was also really struck by the longevity of fan practices in the show. And that was definitely something I wanted to investigate. I've done a lot of fandom research and interviewed a lot of fans, and people's fan objects are really, really important and significant to them, and they take them very seriously. And so I didn't do fan interviews for this, but was really struck by all of the different ways that it wasn't just happening online or in real life. Those Galentine's Day celebrations did not cease in 2015, but they've only gotten more ubiquitous, more prolific in terms of culture. So I thought a lot about what was happening. It was really inspired by what was happening culturally with the show. So yeah.
Yeah, and for me, The Good Place was escapism during a very difficult time. And the message of trying to be a better person, I felt was kind of a tonic.
Yeah.
I would probably say to what was going on culturally at the time.
Yes, because that was it 2016 to 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah. Culturally, what was going on.
So it's interesting how Parks and Rec kind of reflects the culture of the time. And The Good Place is kind of set somewhat against it.
Yeah.
So anyway, let me ask you this.
Tell me.
What makes Parks and Recreation a TV milestone for you?
So the overall argument that I make in the book, and what I think is so significant, is to jump off what you just said in the conversation we were just having, is that it is so reflective of the zeitgeist of that early 2010s, like late aughts, 2010s era, not just culturally. I've already sort of mentioned in terms of politics, but television as a medium. And, I've read your book, and I know that we'll talk a little bit later about how it fits in with our broader understanding of what a sitcom is, and the sitcom genre as a whole. But, there's so much about television that looks different now. It isn't just something that we sit down and in a linear way consume. We can time shift. We're not locked in sort of this temporal and spatial space. And so for me, it is all about the transition of both the culture and the medium. And then adding, as I said just a second ago, the relationship to digital and social media, and the way that became such an important part. And I'm making the argument in this book, like, we have to consider, when we think about what constitutes a television milestone in the 21st century in this post-network era, we have to consider things like the second screen, things like digital media and digital consumption. So what would you say about The Good Place is the overall thing that makes it a television milestone?
Well, there are a couple of elements I think that strike me, and that struck me as I was writing it. And my contention, one, is that it's how do I put this? It's one of the few, and it's not the first. I mean, I would probably choose Soap as the first to do this, the 1970s sitcom with Billy Crystal, and but it is one of the first and one of the only serialized sitcoms. So it's taking sort of the fantasy, drama, and sitcom, and kind of melding it into this sort of fairly unique mix. But it also kind of serves as a commentary on sitcoms themselves, on the creation of sitcoms, and that's the first chapter of the book, is where I kind of talk about the way it serves as a meta text for sitcoms, for sitcom production and production in television more generally. But also because it had a very strong pedagogical impulse that is something that I think American television wants to do and doesn't always accomplish, because we're one of the few countries that doesn't, where the public service channel is not the primary channel, like in the United Kingdom, but in fact didn't really have wasn't really considered part of the pantheon of channels until 1969, when PBS was created. but you have things like procedurals that'll explain, like have two cops explaining procedure when obviously they would know what that is. Well, that's advertising based television trying to teach the audience a little something. So, it's trying to get that educational element in there, but the primary, because it's advertising based, that's the primary motivation is to sell. But, and I'm not saying that they weren't trying to sell with The Good Place, but there was, I've never seen such a teachy sitcom in my life without actually being preachy for the most part.
In a literal way too, right? Because those of you, The Good Place was also a show that I loved. And I don't know that, I would say the penultimate episode of Orange is the New Black, I won't give any spoilers. And then the finale of The Good Place, when I think about, and then the 6 Feet Under finale, when I think about television episodes that made me, had an effective response to where, we say ugly cry a lot, but I would just die if there was like a video of me watching The Good Place finale and the weeping and the noises I was making. It was like a wounded animal. It was not cute. It was just like this very effective, really emotionally resonant response. And I think it's because in some ways of that serialization and the way that you've spent, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about Mike Schur's approach in a minute, but the way that you watched those characters grow and then get rebooted and then grow again, and then like the ultimate place that they got. Oh.
Yeah, and that's the rebooting and resetting that, that's part of its commentary on the sitcom form, because you can have things like, I think I used the example of the Bicycle Man in Different Strokes, which might be a little bit before your time, but it's about like a shop owner who almost or possibly molests 2 of the characters, and it's forgotten by the next episode.
Yeah.
And that's sitcom in the 80s. No wonder Gen X is such, we're such weirdos. This is what we get. It's, we get like being molested in one episode and everything's fine the next. So
I love that too. I write a little bit about serialization because obviously Parks is not nearly as serialized as The Good Place, but it does have those arcs that run seasons, and you've got to know what's happening in season 3 to fully understand and appreciate why Leslie is running for city council and has been approached by these headhunters in season 4. I talk about that a little bit. I believe that Newman and Levine in their book Legitimating Television call it character amnesia, and I really like that because it's exactly like you say. We have to we return to stasis and we return to equilibrium, and it's like, but wait a minute, this thing that just happened, but we don't, when things are episodic and not serialized, there's not that, you didn't really have a reason to, character amnesia is fine. Character amnesia is fine. That's just part of the episodic format. I really like that. The next question that we were going to talk about, speaking of sitcoms, is how you feel like The Good Place, and you've already talked a little bit about this, but how you feel like The Good Place fits within the sitcom genre as a whole.
It's interesting because like I said, I think it borrows that serialization from soap, which actually borrowed it from soap operas more generally. But it also seems to have had, while it doesn't have like the kind of fan base that you were talking about with Parks and Recreation, it actually has had a seemingly significant effect on things that come afterwards, sitcoms that have come afterwards, in terms of, if you look at something like The Office or, sitcom or 30 Rock, I don't want to say they're mean, but there are quite a number of jokes at other people's expense.
I would say they're kind of mean.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. I'll make it. I went to Catholic school, so my meter's all screwed up on meanness, but
when I was having dinner right before this, we were watching a 30 Rock episode from, 2007 or whatever. And I was like, oof, it's tough. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. No. And I think that, certainly it's the culture swings back and forth on this, but it seems to have introduced, I hate saying it like this, but kind of a kinder, gentler comedy where it doesn't necessarily have to be, the humor doesn't have to be at someone else's expense and can still be funny. And, making serialization or even just light serialization a bit more common within the genre. So you have something like Schitt's Creek, which was
Mhm.
airing simultaneously with The Good Place, actually predates it by a year, but its first season, was kind of episodic, and then you get longer term arcs. But of course, I haven't seen a sitcom yet that is as heavily serialized as The Good Place. So I don't know if that's going to be a coming trend, or I know that a lot of trade publications referred to it as a Netflix comedy airing on broadcast.
Yeah.
And because it is one of those few that is kind of made to be binged
Yeah.
in a way
I
that
think that,
other
go ahead,
sitcoms
sorry.
aren't. No, that's okay. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
I think that's such an interesting thing about both of these shows, that they are broadcast sitcoms in an era, and I write a lot about this in the book too, in an era that all but has abandoned broadcast as a model or an expectation of success. Obviously, we have some really good network sitcoms airing right now, thinking specifically of Abbott Elementary. And thinking about like how it fits in the sitcom genre. Obviously, Abbott is inspired by those other mockumentaries. I thought mockumentaries were all the way done, at least on broadcast sitcoms, until Abbott Elementary took off. But I think there's something to be said about the structure of how Mike Schur tells stories in that broadcast format. But one other thing I really, really liked about your book too, and the way that you talked about it being bingeable, and I don't know how many people know this that are watching with us tonight or in the future, is 88 episodes the benchmark for one time? 88 episodes, those 4 seasons of 22 episodes, was the standard order for syndication.
Yeah, 88 to 100 episodes.
Yeah. But that was not something that, in syndication obviously was something that economically was a necessity for the success of a television show and its post life. But one thing I really liked about that you talked about in the book was Mike Schur said, I'm going to tell a story in 4 seasons, and it's how many episodes? 54, 57 or whatever.
I think it was 54. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is so different than the expectation that we have for sitcoms historically and even today, where the 22 episode season order is still pretty normal. And it allowed him to do, because could you imagine a 22? We would have loved it, but could you imagine a 22 episode order of every season of The Good Place? Like how stretched out the story would have been.
It would have been exhausting.
Yeah.
And really expensive.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the other part of it, is there are so many special effects.
Yeah.
That they really, I don't think they could have afforded more than 13 episodes a season. But yeah. There's one thing that I just think is kind of an interesting bit, and then I want you to talk about how you feel Parks and Rec fits into this. What aired on broadcast, and there are certain episodes of The Good Place as to what aired on broadcast or on Netflix is not quite the same as what is on the DVD. And Schur himself refers to the DVDs as a definitive text, DVD, Blu-ray, whatever format you use, because it doesn't materially change the episodes, but there's more material. So rather than deleted scenes, they're actually incorporated back into the episode. So it's kind of fun that, you kind of get just a little bit more nuance, or, an extra joke or something like that. So it's interesting that he chose to do it that way. And I talk about that a little bit in the book. Physical media, even though it was like Netflix kind of launched the show to a great extent and saved it, it's the DVDs that represent the definitive text, physical media.
Yeah.
So
very cool.
So tell me how you think that Parks and Rec affected the sitcom genre. You talk about it a little in your book.
Yeah.
And by a little, I mean a lot. So.
Well, I mean, sort of, not as much as, you really foreground the role that The Good Place, for good reason, because and I think that to that point, Parks is very much a workplace sitcom that is molded in the same way as so many of its predecessors, the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Cheers, and every other place that every other sitcom that we think about not being in a domestic space, very much the same beats. And like I said, we keep bringing up Michael Schur. We have a question about in just a second about his overall approach to television, but I see so much of what ends up happening in The Good Place in terms of storytelling style and structure happening in Parks and Rec, especially because it's serialization light. It is certainly not serialized to the point of The Good Place. And I think one important thing to point out, obviously, for folks listening, is if you think about why you would not serialize a sitcom, and the syndication thing that we talked about is that you want to be able to sell the rights to like TNT or whatever, and you can just like pop in any old episode of Seinfeld or whatever and enjoy it in the same way, because it doesn't require that knowledge of previous episodes to be able to enjoy it. And Parks still has elements of that, certainly, but it is much more serialized than a lot of sitcoms that came before it. But one thing I think is so interesting that maybe dates or maybe just sort of captures the moment of when Parks aired is, and I mentioned this with Abbott Elementary a minute ago, but is that mockumentary style that was, Parks is created by the same folks who created Mike Schur, who was a writer in The Office. And it really, I think a lot of people, and this is in some ways true, that it was conceived of as a spinoff of The Office, but that was, that conceit was abandoned very, very early on in development, but they wanted to stick with that same style. But I think if you've seen both of those shows, you can really tell the difference. Like at the end of The Office, we watched the documentary that was produced, and there's very, very little of that type of, they abandoned the conceit that there was a documentary being produced very early on. There's a quick reference in the pilot episode where Ron's talking to the camera crew. Here and there again, you'll get tiny references, but it is much more just sort of like direct cinema, like observational, which feels like the zeitgeist, very much feels like the zeitgeist of the 2010s. And so I think that is part of what makes Parks significant in the role of, or how it fits within the conversation with sitcoms generally. But I think there was a lot going on in Parks that ended up shaping what Schur did with The Good Place, for sure.
Well, then let me ask you this.
Okay.
Sorry, I just lost my place. How do you feel like, because you've already touched on this a little bit, how do you feel that Parks and Recreation reflects his sensibilities, Mike Schur's sensibilities on views on life, on politics, on humanity more generally?
I don't want to steal your thunder because I know you will talk about this, but you wrote the book about philosophy and understanding philosophy after The Good Place came out, and I read that, and it is a Mike Schur understanding of advanced philosophical concepts, and I could see so much of the way he talked about those things in both Parks and in The Good Place as well. There is just something, and you mentioned the meanness a second ago, there is just something so optimistic about Mike Schur's sensibility and the things that he creates. It is about, I feel like this robust cast of characters, and they're funny, and it doesn't take away. I hate to, it's not like saccharine or cloying. It's just really optimistic. And I think that, as you mentioned, it's a salve for hard things that we might have going on in our lives, and gives us this little antidote to some of those things. But it just feels decidedly optimistic. And it also feels like, and I'll let you talk more about this, but things change, and we have the capacity to change as human beings, and we have the capacity to be better. And I would ask you the same thing in relationship to how it relates to The Good Place.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is that I kind of make the argument, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's made this argument, but by naming the neighborhood architect in The Good Place Michael, I mean, he's mocking himself to a great extent, especially the way in the first season before you get the big reveal. And if you haven't seen the show, I won't spoil it for you, but he really micromanages the hell out of everything.
Yeah.
And you understand why by the end of the first season, but I mean, that's what a showrunner does. He's, kind of a friendly nightmare to a great extent. And given the revelations about a lot of different showrunners, including one I wrote a book about. It's mentioned in my introduction. You know, by he's commenting on, you know, it's commenting on both his role and the role of creation more generally. But I think, I mean, he's been pretty straightforward about what The Good Place is trying to accomplish, or what it says about him, that, you know, you try, basically don't suck. Try not to be a bad person. Try to think of other people, which isn't a radical message. But again, during the time period when when it aired, sadly, it kind of was a radical message. Like, don't put other people down. Don't be mean just because you can, you know, and I think I've seen some jokes about, you know, how many people on Parks and Rec would have gotten into The Good Place just based on how they treated Jerry.
Yes. And I was going to say,
So-
like, that came to my brain and I was like, remember to say that whatever Erin said made you think about Jerry and how, oh, it was the jokes at his expense. And it's tough, right? And it's like, when you love a text, you have to be able to criticize it too. But I definitely thought about that as well.
And so I think, you know, I mean, there's an argument, there are arguments to be made and have been made about the danger of incrementalism. And that Michael Schur, especially when you look at a text like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, kind of embodies that, like, just try a little to be a little bit better than tomorrow. But while in the case of The Good Place, it works, in the case of something as fraught as policing in this country, it doesn't resonate in the same way.
Yeah.
And in fact, one could argue that, in fact, somebody did argue, and I cited in the book, that The Good Place actually makes a better point about the cruelty of the prison system and the criminal justice system than Brooklyn Nine-Nine does. Because it's basically, the bad place is basically prison, but it's not about rehabilitation. It's very starkly not about that. So it ends up being kind of an interesting and subversive take on that. If people can get better, then why are you just torturing them with penis bees and, you know, twisting them until they break, because that doesn't make them any better of people.
Who is the philosopher that Michael quotes? What do we owe to others? You talk about this.
T.M. Scanlon, what we owe to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the text of the whole series.
Yeah. And that's just wonderful, you know, it's because that is fundamentally the question, I feel like, in some ways in Parks, right? But also, I mean, just like in The Good Place, that undergirds everything that the characters end up doing at the end of the series, for sure.
And let me throw that question to you. What do you feel like? I mean, I've read your book, so I know what you think, but what would you can you summarize how you'd feel about Parks and Rec and how it reflects Schur's vision?
Yeah, well, and I think that in relationship to politics, and he quotes this, and the 2008 election cycle between McCain and Obama was what drove the idea to bring this down to a local government level. Fundamentally, I think, and I've read a lot of his work and a lot of quotes by him where he talks about being good to other people and understanding that we have things in common. I mean, and it's hard, right? Because what Parks does at that micro level is make politics an interpersonal project. When we look at it through Ron and Leslie, these are friends whose ideological conflict is very much one of the cores of the series. But at the end of the day, they love each other. And we know that it doesn't always work like that. And so as much as I love Schur's work, I think you're right. I mean, like, it's the incrementalism, right? Like, that we could look past some things that can be actively harmful. We don't see that in Ron and Leslie. We see they love and respect each other very much. But we know that that isn't always necessarily the case, and we can't always make those concessions. But I think his views, much like on morality, much like on lots of things about politics, are also pretty optimistic to a fault. One thing I thought was so interesting, and it makes sense, but he, until the series finale, did not label, I mean, we all sort of knew, I guess, but did not label Leslie as a Democrat or a Republican. It was just very much rooted in her good works and her governmental service. So I think that's sort of an interesting, and to your point, I mean, the next question we were going to talk about, and you mentioned this earlier, but how Parks reflects the cultural zeitgeist of when it aired, or sorry, The Good Place.
Yeah, and actually, I think we've covered that.
Yeah.
Talking about other things. So let me, let's skip to what do you think will contribute to the longevity of The Good Place? I'm sorry.
We
That's my
both did
question.
it, right?
Yeah.
We're being very self-centered tonight.
Yeah, it's all about us.
My short answer to this, and I'm happy if people have questions in the chat afterward, but my short answer to this is the digital fan practices. I have a whole book on that. And I think that especially, I love to go look at Parks and Rec fan groups on Facebook, on the subreddit, the Parks and Rec subreddit, other digital spaces I find myself in, because the show has been off the air since for 8 years now, since 2015, and there is new content produced every single day. And a lot of what's happening is Parks content being used to comment on current cultures. How memes work, right? Anyway, but to comment on current cultural happenings or whatever's going on in the world at the time. And so I think part of that, those digital fan practices, and especially when we take those offline and we think about Valentine's Day or Treat Yourself Day, which has an actual calendar day. Treat Yourself Day is actually October 13th. If anybody needs to mark that down to be able to treat yourself in October. The way that those, if you look at the social media hashtags on any sort of social media space, I look at Instagram a lot whenever I was doing my research and for a presentation I have coming up in a few weeks. Millions and millions and millions of tags with Valentine's Day and treat yourself or however people stylize it. Parks was a low-rated sitcom for the entire 7 years of its run, and the likelihood that all of those people who are invoking those hashtags were fans or are current fans of Parks and Rec is really slim. It's just like not statistically likely. So what I think is so interesting and what contributes to its longevity is in part that every time that you hashtag Valentine's Day or you go to a Valentine's Day party, every time you hashtag treat yourself or go get your nails done or whatever it is and invoke those things, you are participating in Parks and Recreation fandom, even if unintentionally. And it's hard to say, I think, if that has created, I certainly believe it has to. You go to a Valentine's Day party and you're talking about the origins of Valentine's Day being Parks and Recreation, and then maybe your girlfriend has mentioned this and you go home and you watch it. That feels reasonable to me, and we have no way to know. But Parks and Recreation's fan base was very young. I mean, it was a young demographic. It was a pretty affluent demographic. And they have lifetimes to develop these holidays, these traditions. And we know that holidays are about tradition. And so I can certainly believe that it's going to be, 2000 if the world doesn't burn, it's going to be like 2064, and I'll be maybe having a Valentine's Day party at the retirement community with my girlfriends. So I think that's part of it. So I'm interested in hearing how you would say the same thing about The Good Place.
Well, it's funny because like I mentioned before, it doesn't have the same fan community that Parks and Rec has. But I think like I said, you can see it on its effect on other shows like, say, Ted Lasso.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, maybe it doesn't have to always be mean.
Yeah.
So there is that. There are more sitcoms are becoming a little bit more serialized or bingeable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's kind of interesting is the way that you kind of see in memes and in other things, the conflation of, oh, this is the bad place and Community is the darkest timeline.
Yeah.
So, it's like the two of them have kind of melded in a weird sort of way in that respect. And I don't know. I don't actually want to make any predictions about its longevity because, I think it should have a long shelf life, but we don't really know what turns the culture is going to be in.
Yeah. One thing you talked about in your book I really liked, though, is that in part thinking about the literal long game, Michael Schur avoided time references that might situate it temporally, which I think certainly contributes to, this is something, because I go back and I watch things that I watched in the early aughts and I'm like, oh my God, and I think Parks will feel that way. Parks will always feel locked in 2012. Leslie Knope 2012, it will always feel locked in 2012 in that era. But I think the good part of like my argument, I don't mean to say this is what I think about The Good Place, but I think part of it is like you bring up in your book that it's not as it's much more temporally ambiguous. And we're always wrestling with those philosophical questions and ideas about morality.
Yeah, even if it takes a few shots at the baby boomers, which I have a hard time objecting to. So, as a Gen Xer.
Yeah. Tell me, as a millennial, as an old millennial, I do understand. Tell me what you're working on next. What TV show are you writing about?
Actually, I'm writing about 9 different TV shows, but I'm working on a book on metafiction, the metafictional impulse in television. Excuse me. So I'll be looking at shows from. That's part of the reason why I brought up Soap, from Soap to WandaVision, and kind of talking about how self-reflectiveness and meta-ness has been a part of television for a long time. Cool. Possibly since the beginning. So that's my argument in a nutshell. What about you?
I am currently editing a book about television comedy and cultural crisis. So we are looking at how television comedy is used to negotiate, navigate tough stuff. We're talking about democracy, we're talking about education, we're talking about identity discourses. There is a chapter about The Good Place and morality and thinking about those questions. So I'm working on that. And then I am also writing about the Hulu series Shrill and about post-feminist fat femininity. And that is an audience study. That's one of the ones where I had to be comfortable hearing the sound of my own voice because I interviewed folks for that. But I'm excited about both these projects. As my sabbatical trickles to an end, it's already April. Makes me very sad.
Yeah.
That happens. Rachel, if you want to hop in and take questions, if you all have, I think there's one down there. But if you all have questions, we are quite happy to answer.
Hello. And I was taking notes too, so I might have a question for you. So yeah, let's hop into this question that Christopher sent us a little while ago that I think is probably definitely something that we want to talk about, especially since we're talking about 2 published books that you guys have created. So he says that for both authors, this has to do with your research process in handling such a large text as a television series. What is your process for singling out and selecting key episodes? And he says, for example, did the content or themes of certain episodes dictate the structure of the book in any way? That's very interesting.
I can answer that. I know Parks so well. I've watched the series so many times, and again after writing the book I think I thought I would be sick of it, and so I knew, I guess the second way that you described that, I knew what I wanted to argue. I mean, I knew what my overall argument, after I did some editing and revision, but ultimately what came out, I knew what I want my argument to be. And I know the series so well that I knew exactly where to go. I don't always know the episode titles, but I'm like, episode where blah, 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 blah happens, and I can find it easily and I can go and I can get back into the text. That isn't always the case when I write about television, because I don't always, actually never, because I don't think I know a show as well as I know Parks and Recreation. But it always feels emergent to me. So I'm writing about, one other thing I didn't mention, I'm writing about Ted Lasso. And it is something that struck me as I was watching the series. I'm going to have to go back and look for the things that I'm sort of structuring my argument around. But that's what my process looks like.
Yeah. And for me, The Good Place was easy because it's so serialized that, it was very easy to pick out the elements that I wanted to talk about. And it was easy to watch. I mean, it's 54 episodes. If I watch 4 episodes a day, then, I can get through it pretty quickly. It's not like something like Buffy where it's 144 episodes. Yes, it's sad that I know that, but there you go. Yeah, because there are such strong thematic elements, it works really well. But it's actually, I tend to be kind of, lately I've been kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A little slutty in my television habits, so to speak. It's like, I can't just, what I like about the TV Milestones format is that it's longer than an article, but not as long as like a 70,000 word book.
Yeah.
So you don't really get sick of the topic. You don't
Yeah.
have time to get sick of it. So when I'm writing longer pieces like the meta book, or another one that I'm working on teen horror in books, in novels, film, and television, there's a lot I can do. If I get bored with one thing, I can go to another. But yeah, oftentimes my brain, I'll kind of pick up little themes, and I'll maybe jot down a note or two. And then, yeah, that's how I would select what I would go back to for things that aren't as serialized as The Good Place. But The Good Place is kind of a special case because of the way it's structured.
Yeah.
It's such a unique show in so many ways too. I feel like it's almost one of the questions I wanted to ask you too is, I think it's really interesting that we're talking about a show that Parks and Rec, Mike Schur was a part of, and then The Good Place came right after that, essentially. So Holly, do you feel like, well, both of you guys, do you feel like the way that he went from Parks and Rec, which I would say, especially in the earlier seasons, had sort of very long, almost unwieldy seasons, with that sort of old-fashioned 22, 23 episode runs, then going into The Good Place, which had such shorter seasons, felt more coherent in the way of like it's a finite story. Do you how do you feel about that, Holly, especially with like the idea of this is an earlier draft of Mike Schur's sort of presentation?
One fun fact that I love about Mike Schur, as the Mike Schur fan, is that with the success of Parks, and two fun facts. He wrote every season finale as if it was a series finale, because it was so low rated that they were so worried it was never going to get like renewed, because they never knew when they were shooting the finale if it was picked up for the next year. So that's my first thing that I always love. The second thing I love is after Parks. I mean, Parks is, became a critical darling and is a fan favorite, sort of a cult situation, but it never had high ratings. I think 4.5 million was the average. But NBC saw the value in Mike Schur to basically, when Parks is wrapping up, they basically gave him carte blanche to like do whatever. Like, here you go, make us another television show that became The Good Place. And I love that because I think that does a couple of things. It links Parks as this predecessor in terms of sensibility, and Mike Schur as in, that auteur showrunner's auteur type thing when we're thinking about their overall body of work. But to your question, Rachel, is I think in Erin talking about the serialization and the way that, I mean, in a lot of ways, there are serialized elements to Parks. There are ongoing arcs and stories, but it is still episodic in a lot of ways that the Good Place just is. I mean, The Good Place is I hate when we call television a 13-hour movie because it's TV. And it doesn't need to be a movie. I just have strong feelings about that. But it is serialized in a way that I don't know how you come in to season 3, episode 9 of The Good Place and have any idea what's going on. I think you could come into season 3, episode 9 I should have said season 3, episode 13, which is my favorite episode of Parks. That is The Fight. It's the best. So everybody's favorite. And I had to pick images from that when they all go get drunk on snake juice and they're all doing the interviews. It is the best. Everybody's just like a universally beloved episode. but you can come into the fight and you can have a good old time with Parks and Rec season 3, episode 13. Not the case with The Good Place. So
No,
Erin,
because if I'm not mistaken, season 3, episode 9 of The Good Place is Janet's, which all takes place in
which is
Janet's
so good.
void. Yeah, and
So good,
you will
though.
not understand anything that's going on because Darcy Carden plays every single character.
Which, how did she not win an Emmy for that? First of all, I don't understand.
He was robbed.
But I think that there was actually a question I wanted to ask Holly because I think it's interesting in terms of I've always wondered about the mockumentary format in Parks and Rec, and this is probably a huge reach, so you can laugh at me if you want to, but I almost wonder if it isn't sort of a subtle bit about accountability and transparency in government, because there's not really cameras, but Leslie and others are addressing someone.
Yeah.
So it's almost like they're explaining what's going on, and it sort of like a low-key accountability for their actions within the government of Pawnee.
I don't hate that interpretation. The critics that I talk about in the book say that part of what allowed Parks to differentiate itself from The Office was that it abandoned that conceit early on, because it was like there was too many comparisons to that. And so rather than being a text being produced, it just became a storytelling style. But I do like your interpretation. I'm probably going to steal that for the future.
That's fine. You can have it. Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I was just thinking about also how anytime I talk to anybody about Parks and Recreation, most people say, oh, just skip the first season and go into the second season. And I think it's going back to that thing where, you know, the initial idea was it being a Parks, an Office sort of sequel or whatever. And then they realized like, oh, this is not going to work. And do you think that's because whereas in The Office, we're in like a private business setting, in Parks and Rec, we're in a public government setting? And maybe just it's kind of like a hat on a hat where, you know, if you have bad work environment, but also government, that it might be too much.
That's a really interesting question that I've not really thought about. I think they got incredibly lucky. I do not advocate skipping the first season. It is 6 episodes. You can get through 2 hours.
It's so foundational.
Well, in the season 1 finale, Rock Show is so good. I mean, you get the pit from that, like, you know, all the things in Andy's cast, like there's so much good stuff happening. And I think it lays a lot of important groundwork. However, that was the truncated season, you know, 6 episode season had everything to do with the writer's strike that year. And so it was a blessing in disguise for them, because it gave them the chance to get all of that feedback, which the first season is pretty universally panned. I have love for it just because I have love for the whole series and what's happening. And again, the Pit song comes out of the first season. But they were able, especially with Leslie's character, they tried to make Michael Scott 2.0. And I don't know if it's a government thing or it's a gender thing.
I was going to say.
Yeah. And that Michael Scott, Steve Carell, I find is so charming. Like if anybody ever tells me that he's a jerk, it will be really hard on me. But I think he has the privilege of being able to do that total cluelessness, and in a way that, like, there's a lot of The Office that we cringe at today. They're like, oh my God, because it's just a different cultural time. But they tried to do that with Leslie, and it just didn't do the same. It just didn't, like, and Amy, like, I think it has to do with gender. Like, let's just let Amy Poehler be this badass. And it ended up being such an inspiration, a whole chapter about identity that really focuses on Leslie as sort of a post-feminist character. But I mean, she's an avowed feminist and she is so competent. And if anybody calls me Leslie Knope, I take that as a huge compliment. That would have not been the case in season 1, because she was a ding dong. And I think they made such a smart decision. Not just that, but there were a lot of like beats. And when Adam Scott and Rob Lowe show up at the end of the second season, which is what I tell everybody, that's when it takes off. Like that's when season 3 and season 4 to me flawless comedy. I mean, it's just so good from 1 minute to the end. But to your point, I don't know. I just like, I was going to steal Erin's comment from a second ago. I think I'm going to steal that interpretation about, government being a hard pill to swallow in terms of us watching it.
Yeah.
Well, and then Erin, I had, as we were talking about Amy Poehler, but as we were talking about Leslie Knope being such a sort of likable character, I think it's really interesting that we go from Leslie Knope, very likable main character, to Eleanor, who is on the, like, he stacks the deck with how sort of unlikable she's supposed to be. So
Yeah.
I think rhetorically that translates.
Well, and it's interesting because she is kind of in some ways ends up being kind of a mix of Leslie Knope, because she is, she has her own opinions about things. She can railroad people. She has no problem doing that. But it owes a little bit to Veronica Mars as well. And Kristen Bell's, she was in played Veronica in Veronica Mars, as kind of a hard-boiled teen detective. And so this sort of hard edge that Kristen Bell brings to the character is very familiar if you've watched Veronica Mars. And what I like about it is that she doesn't ever really lose that, even though she changes for the better. She doesn't really, she's not needing to be retooled in the same way that you see like season 1 Ding Dong Leslie shift in season 2 to somebody more competent. But she just is like, she retains her Eleanorness but learns to actually look outside of herself, and get past her past, the hard parts of her past that kind of made her put the shell over herself. So it's nice to see to watch Jason and Tahani and Eleanor and Chidi change without losing their essential Tahaniness or Jasonness or Chidiness or Eleanorness. And that's a rough road that's not easy to write. So I have a lot of appreciation for managing to, not turn somebody into that. Changing a character doesn't mean you change their essentials. And so I appreciate the show a lot for keeping the characters essentially themselves while letting them grow and develop. I think that's it. That's all I had to say about that. So
yeah, so I don't have any more questions. Did you guys have any sort of closing thoughts and whatnot before we finish up here?
Just thanks for coming and listen to us talk. We really appreciate it.
And we really appreciate you letting us natter on and talk about things that we love, because we both love talking about TV and watching TV, and probably giving it more more attention than it sometimes merits, but that's okay. Because good TV and bad TV, we can write about both. So there was, excuse me, sorry, go ahead. And I want to thank Boswell Books for having us and letting us do this. It's really appreciated, and I hope it was of interest to the people who managed to come.
Absolutely. We thank you both so much for doing this and for bringing this TV Milestone series to our attention. There are quite a few other books in this series as well. You can purchase a copy of one or both of these, or multiple copies of these, from our bookstore. I do have links in the comments, but please just any independent bookstore, just call them up and let them know that you would like to purchase a copy of this book. Thank you so much for being here, both of you. We would not have a bookstore without any of you guys.
Awesome.
Thank you. And thank you
Thank you
for,
so much.
we love independent bookstores. So thank you for existing.